The flight that changed everything. The hum of the jet engines vibrated through the walls of the airport lounge as 10-year-old Noah Bennett sat quietly in a plush first-class seat. His fingers gripped the armrest, not out of fear, but with the quiet excitement that came with flying alone for the first time. His mother had reassured him that everything would be fine, that he should enjoy the experience. The seat beneath him was softer than he had imagined, much more comfortable than the economy seats he usually flew in when traveling with his family. A screen in front of him flickered with a bright, "Welcome aboard" message, and he reached into his backpack, pulling out a pair of noise-canceling headphones. The flight attendants bustled through the cabin, their uniforms crisp, their movements precise. They refilled drinks, adjusted overhead compartments, and greeted each passenger with the same polished smile. Noah had barely gotten his headphones on when a shadow loomed over him. A tall woman with perfectly pinned blonde hair and a name tag that read Ms. Wallace stood in front of his seat, arms crossed. Her sharp gaze landed on him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, her voice a mix of politeness and patronization. "Are you lost?" Noah blinked, caught off guard. He shook his head. "No, Mom. This is my seat." He pointed to the boarding pass tucked under the tray table in front of him. His mother had double-checked it before he boarded, making sure he sat exactly where he belonged. Ms. Wallace didn't even glance at the boarding pass. Instead, she gave him a tight, forced smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "First class is reserved for our premium passengers," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Where are your parents?" Noah felt his hands tighten around his headphones. He had already been warned that people might treat him differently. He just hadn't expected it to happen before the plane had even taken off. "I'm flying alone," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I have a ticket." Ms. Wallace's eyebrows lifted slightly as if she found that hard to believe. She held out her hand. "Let me see it, sweetheart." He hesitated, but slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out the ticket his mother had printed for him. Ms. Wallace snatched it from his hand, her eyes scanning the details, lips pressing into a thin line. The ticket was real, and they both knew it, but something in her expression made it clear that she still wasn't convinced. She handed it back but didn't move. "How did you get this ticket?" she asked, the sweetness in her voice now replaced with skepticism. Noah blinked. "My mom bought it for me." The forced smile disappeared altogether. Ms. Wallace's expression hardened. "Listen," she said, lowering herself slightly so they were at eye level. "I don't know what happened here, but there's clearly been a mix-up. First class is for paying passengers only. You'll need to move to the back." Noah felt heat rush to his face. "But this is my seat," he whispered. Ms. Wallace straightened, shaking her head as if she were dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Come on now," she said, her voice a little louder, enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Let's not make a scene. Gather your things, and I'll find you a seat where you belong." The words stung. Where you belong. Noah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes watching him. Some curious, some indifferent, some even agreeing with her unspoken implication. No one said anything. Slowly, he grabbed his backpack, his hand shaking as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped into the aisle. His legs wobbled slightly, his face burning with embarrassment. Ms. Wallace didn't look at him again. She was already moving toward the galley, satisfied that she had done her job. As Noah walked toward the back of the plane, he pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled as he typed a message. "Mom, they made me leave my seat." He slumped into the cramped economy seat, his heart still pounding. He didn't understand what had just happened. He had done everything right, checked his ticket, followed the rules. But none of that had mattered. The flight attendants hadn't even checked the passenger list. They had just looked at him and decided. A storm begins to brew. The plane had barely started taxiing when his phone buzzed. His mother had replied. "What do you mean they made you leave your seat?" Noah quickly typed back. The flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class. She made me move to the back. There was a long moment of silence. Then, the 3 little dots appeared, showing that she was typing. What's the flight number? Noah's heart started beating faster. He quickly checked his boarding pass and typed the number back as fast as his fingers would allow. He had seen his mother handle situations before. Calm, precise, ruthless when necessary. But something about the way she had asked made his stomach tighten. The reply came almost instantly. Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything. Noah let out a slow breath, but the tightness in his chest didn't go away. He knew that tone, even in a text. It was the tone his mother used when someone was about to regret their decisions. Meanwhile, in a high-rise office thousands of miles away, in a sleek glass office high above the city skyline, Evelyn Bennett, CEO of Bennett Air, leaned back in her leather chair. The conference call continued in the background, but she was no longer listening. Her eyes were locked on the message from her son, her only son. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Her child had been humiliated on a plane she owned. The head of flight operations was still speaking, unaware that Evelyn's mind was already calculating, strategizing. Ms. Bennett, her assistant, Lucas Ward, cleared his throat nervously. Evelyn's voice was calm when she spoke, but there was steel behind it. Get me the captain of Flight 317. Now. Lucas hesitated. Ma'am, they've already begun taxiing. Evelyn's eyes darkened. I didn't ask if they had started taxiing, she said, her voice like ice. I said, get me the captain. Lucas swallowed hard and immediately picked up the phone. Evelyn sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Ms. Wallace had no idea what was about to happen. The call that shook the skies. 35,000 feet in the air, a flight in chaos. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but the atmosphere inside Flight 317 was tense. Noah sat stiffly in his cramped economy seat, his fists clenched in his lap. The whispers had died down, but the sting of humiliation lingered like an open wound. He had never felt so small, so insignificant, like he didn't belong, even though he had every right to be where he was. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign, turning off, barely registered in his mind. A flight attendant, not Ms. Wallace, but a younger woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Grace, paused next to him. Can I get you something, sweetheart? She asked gently, her voice soft. Noah shook his head. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. Okay, she said hesitantly before moving on. He could feel the stares. Some passengers were pretending not to notice him, acting as if nothing had happened, while others shot him awkward glances from across the aisle. They had seen everything. The way Ms. Wallace had publicly embarrassed him, how he had been forced to gather his things and walk to the back of the plane like he was being punished. And yet, not one of them had spoken up. Not one had said, hey, that's not right. Not one had questioned why a 10-year-old boy was being forced out of his seat. Noah turned to look out the small oval window, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced down. A new message from his mother. Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything. Noah exhaled slowly. His mother never said anything without meaning it. And something told him Ms. Wallace's problems were only beginning. The call that changed everything. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Langston had his hand steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Flying was second nature to him. He had logged over 20 years of experience, and there weren't many situations that could rattle him. But when the in-flight phone buzzed in its holder, something in his gut twisted. The call was coming directly from headquarters. That never happened mid-flight. Exchanging a glance with his co-pilot, Langston reached over and picked up the receiver. This is Captain Langston, he said smoothly. A pause. Then, a calm yet unyielding voice came through the line. Captain Langston, this is Evelyn Bennett. The temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop 10 degrees. Langston straightened in his seat. He had never spoken to the CEO of Bennett Air in his entire career. Very few people did. She was a force of nature, the type of woman who only called when something major had gone wrong. And now she was calling him. "Yes, ma'am," Langston said quickly. There was no hesitation in Evelyn Bennett's voice as she continued. "I need to know why my son was just removed from his first-class seat." Langston froze. His son. The flight manifest flashed in his mind. Noah Bennett. His fingers tightened around the phone. There were only two ways this conversation could go, one where he handled it correctly, or one where he became a headline. "Ma'am, I was not made aware of any issue," Langston said carefully. "Would you like me to?" "I don't need an excuse," Evelyn cut in smoothly. "I need you to fix this. Now." Langston swallowed. "Yes, Mom." Before he could say another word, the line went dead. Langston set the receiver down and turned to his co-pilot. "Find out exactly what the hell happened back there," he muttered. The co-pilot gave a short nod before flipping the switch to contact the head flight attendant. Within moments, the intercom crackled overhead. "Ms. Wallace, please report to the cockpit immediately." The moment of reckoning. Ms. Wallace had just finished pouring champagne for a first-class passenger when the intercom summoned her. Her brows furrowed. The captain never personally called for flight attendants unless something was seriously wrong. Her heels clicked against the carpet as she made her way toward the cockpit, still feeling the satisfaction of correcting the seating mistake earlier. When she entered, Captain Langston turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. "Ms. Wallace," he said evenly, "did you remove a child from his first-class seat?" Ms. Wallace straightened her posture, folding her hands behind her back. "Yes, Captain." There was. Langston's jaw tightened. "You removed a child without checking the flight manifest, without verifying his ticket." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Ms. Wallace's face. I believed it was a mistake," she said. "A child traveling alone in first class is highly unusual, and—" Langston cut her off. "You believed it was a mistake," he repeated. His voice was still calm, but there was an edge of steel underneath. "And what exactly led you to that belief, Ms. Wallace?" She hesitated. Langston exhaled through his nose. "Ms. Wallace, do you know who that child is?" She frowned. That's Noah Bennett." Ms. Wallace's stomach dropped. Langston's voice was firm. "His mother is Evelyn Bennett, the CEO of this airline." Silence. Ms. Wallace felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the cockpit. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had just publicly humiliated the son of the most powerful woman in the airline industry. Langston leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "She just called me. She isn't happy." Ms. Wallace swallowed. "The CEO has given direct orders," Langston continued. "You are to escort Noah Bennett back to his first-class seat immediately, and you will apologize to him." Ms. Wallace's face burned with humiliation. "Captain, Langston held up a hand. "Ms. Wallace, I am giving you a direct order. You will fix this, or you will be removed from this flight upon landing." Ms. Wallace nodded stiffly, forcing herself to remain professional. "Yes, Captain." Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned and walked out of the cockpit, her legs feeling like lead. She had spent her entire career commanding authority. But now she was the one who had just lost control. Back in economy. Noah was staring at the seat in front of him when he felt a shadow fall over him. He looked up. Ms. Wallace stood there, her expression unreadable. The same woman who had forced him out of first class was now standing awkwardly beside his seat. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Noah waited. Ms. Wallace cleared her throat. "There has been a misunderstanding," she said stiffly. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Noah didn't move. "Why?" he asked. Ms. Wallace's jaw tightened. "I should have verified your ticket properly," she admitted. "I apologize." Noah stared at her. She wasn't apologizing because she was sorry. She was apologizing because she had to. After a moment, he nodded slowly. Then, without a word, he stood, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. As he walked back to first class, every eye in the cabin was on him. And this time, they all knew exactly who he was. The walk of shame. Aisles of judgment. Noah felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him as he walked back toward the first-class section. A few passengers turned away, suddenly very interested in their in-flight entertainment screens. Others avoided his gaze entirely, pretending not to see him at all. But some watched intently, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to deep discomfort. No one had said anything when Ms. Wallace forced him out of his seat. But now they had no choice but to watch him take it back. Ms. Wallace, the once composed and unyielding flight attendant, was walking slightly ahead of him, her stiff posture betraying the humiliation rolling off of her in waves. Her once authoritative stride had been replaced by hesitant steps, her confidence crumbling with every inch of ground they covered. Noah could feel it. She hated this. She hated that she was being forced to escort him back, to publicly undo what she had done. For the first time since she had wronged him, she was the one feeling small. The flight had been in the air for just over an hour, but the power dynamic had already shifted completely. And everyone could see it. The curtain separating economy from first class came into view, as Ms. Wallace pulled it aside and gestured for him to step through. Noah couldn't help but notice something. She wouldn't look him in the eye. Back where he belonged. The luxurious first-class cabin stretched out before him, its plush leather seats and expansive legroom a stark contrast to the cramped, overcrowded rows in the back of the plane. Noah's original seat, his rifle seat, was empty, waiting for him. A few first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had witnessed everything earlier. They had watched as Ms. Wallace removed him without hesitation. And now, they were witnessing her forced retreat. Noah slid into the oversized leather chair, placing his backpack at his feet. Ms. Wallace hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the seat in front of him. Then, in a voice so tight it barely passed through her lips, she spoke. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." It was the least sincere apology Noah had ever heard. She wasn't sorry. She was embarrassed. He could tell. He knew that the only reason she was standing here, uttering these words, was because of his mother. Because of who she was. Because Ms. Wallace had no choice. Noah studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "Would you have made me leave if you knew who my mom was?" Ms. Wallace's face stiffened. She hesitated. "That's not." Noah tilted his head. "Would you?" Silence. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their attention now locked on the interaction. Ms. Wallace's jaw clenched. She inhaled sharply, choosing her words carefully. "That is not how we conduct our service," she said finally, avoiding his question entirely. Noah nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "That's what I thought." Her nostrils flared slightly, and for a brief second, he could see it. The frustration, the humiliation, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Then, with one stiff nod, she turned and walked away, disappearing behind the curtain. The air in the first-class cabin felt different now. The balance had shifted. And Noah, for the first time since the flight started, he felt something else entirely. Power. Meanwhile, on the ground, in the towering glass headquarters of Bennett Air, the atmosphere was anything but calm. A team of high-level executives, PR specialists, and legal advisors sat around a sleek oval conference table. Every laptop was open. Every phone was buzzing. Every pair of eyes was locked on Evelyn Bennett. The CEO sat at the head of the table, her fingers steepled, her expression unreadable. But anyone who knew her, truly knew her, would recognize the dangerous edge in her stillness. Lucas Ward, her head of public relations, shifted in his seat, his tablet balanced against his knee. "Ms. Bennett," he began carefully, "we've already had multiple media outlets reach out about the incident. A passenger in economy recorded a video." Evelyn exhaled sharply through her nose. "Of course they did," she muttered. Lucas hesitated, scrolling through his screen before continuing. "The video is gaining traction on social media. The comments are—" He glanced up at her. "Unforgiving." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Unforgiving toward whom?" Lucas paused, then met her gaze. "Toward us." A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Toward Bennett Air?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "People aren't just mad at the flight attendant. They're questioning the airline itself. They're asking how many times this has happened before, how many times it's gone unchecked." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her mind turning over the situation like a puzzle. This wasn't just about Noah anymore. This was about the entire airline industry. And more importantly, this was about making an example. She placed her hands on the table and spoke with the calm, decisive authority that had built her empire. "Draft a formal statement," she ordered. "Make it clear that this was an isolated incident, but that we are taking it very seriously." Lucas nodded, typing rapidly. Evelyn continued, her tone razor-sharp. "I want a full internal review of our airline's customer service policies. I want a mandatory bias training program implemented across all departments, not just flight crews. And I want Ms. Wallace's employment status under immediate evaluation." Lucas swallowed. "Immediate termination." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her dark eyes narrowing. "No," she said. "Not yet." Lucas hesitated. "Ma'am, the public is calling for her resignation." Evelyn nodded. "I know, but we're not going to let them dictate how we handle this." She leaned forward. "I want to see if Ms. Wallace is willing to admit she was wrong. If she refuses, she's done. If she acknowledges what she did, genuinely, then we use this as an opportunity for reform." Lucas tapped a note into his tablet. "And if she refuses?" Evelyn's eyes darkened. "Then I make sure she never works in this industry again." Back on Flight 317, Noah stared out of the first-class window, watching the soft horizon of clouds stretch for miles beneath them. His phone vibrated in his hand. A message from his mother. "Everything is being handled. Just sit tight, sweetheart. This flight is almost over." Noah exhaled, his mind racing. She was right. The flight was almost over. But something told him. This story was only just beginning. The reckoning at 35,000 feet. A quiet storm in first class. Noah sank into his first-class seat, the oversized leather swallowing his small frame. Despite being back where he rightfully belonged, the tension in the air felt thick, like an unspoken truth hovering just above everyone's heads. Passengers who had previously ignored him now stole quick, guilty glances. Some had seen everything. They had witnessed Ms. Wallace's assumptions, her tone, her dismissal of him without a second thought. But they had stayed silent. And now, they all knew who he was. They knew what they had allowed to happen. Noah exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of his phone. His mother's last text still glowed on the screen. "Everything is being handled. Just sit tight." His mom never made empty promises. And Ms. Wallace was about to find out exactly what that meant. Ms. Wallace's final flight. Back in the galley, Ms. Wallace gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Her mind was spinning. She had never been called to the cockpit mid-flight before. She had never been humiliated in front of an entire cabin. And she had never made a mistake this colossal. No, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophe. She had single-handedly mishandled a situation that now had consequences bigger than she could control. Noah Bennett. She hadn't recognized the name at first, but now that she did, it was too late. A fellow flight attendant, Lisa, a junior member of the crew, walked by, pausing when she saw the turmoil on Ms. Wallace's face. "You okay?" Lisa asked, though there was something unreadable in her tone. Ms. Wallace forced a stiff nod. "Fine." Lisa tilted her head. "You don't look fine." Ms. Wallace gritted her teeth. "I said I'm fine." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Right." Then, after a pause, she leaned in slightly. "Just curious," she murmured, lowering her voice. "If he wasn't the CEO's son, would you still have made him move?" Ms. Wallace's stomach twisted. "Drop it," she snapped. Lisa sighed, shaking her head before walking away. For the first time in her career, Ms. Wallace felt exposed. And the worst part, she knew she deserved it. Meanwhile, in the CEO's office, thousands of miles away, in the heart of the city, Evelyn Bennett stood in front of the glass windows of her corner office, staring down at the bustling streets below. Her assistant, Lucas Ward, waited behind her, his clipboard in hand, his expression tight. "Ms. Bennett," Lucas said, clearing his throat. "The statement is ready for release." Evelyn didn't turn around. "Read it to me." Lucas adjusted his glasses, scanning the document. "Bennett Air is committed to providing an equal and fair experience for all passengers. We do not condone discrimination of any kind. Following an internal review, we will be implementing new training procedures to ensure that all staff are held to the highest standards." He looked up at her. "It doesn't mention your son by name." Evelyn finally turned, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "No," she said, "because this isn't just about my son." Lucas nodded. "So, what now?" Evelyn folded her arms. "Now," she said, "I speak to Ms. Wallace myself." Lucas hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure that's necessary?" Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She needs to understand exactly what she did. And more importantly, she needed to understand that this wasn't just going to go away. Evelyn grabbed her phone, dialing a direct number to Flight 317. "Patch me through to the captain." The call that made Ms. Wallace freeze. Back on the plane, in the cockpit, Captain Langston was already anticipating the call when the flight deck phone buzzed again. He picked it up. "This is Langston." The voice on the other end was calm, cold, and dangerously controlled. "Captain Langston, put Ms. Wallace on the line." Langston didn't hesitate. "Understood." He pressed the crew intercom. "Ms. Wallace, please report to the cockpit. Now." Ms. Wallace's final walk. Ms. Wallace's legs felt like concrete as she walked toward the cockpit. Passengers watched her go, their expressions ranging from disdain to indifference. She could already feel it, the shift in power, the crumbling of her authority. She had always controlled the narrative in her section. Not this time. With a deep breath, she knocked once and stepped inside. Captain Langston handed her the phone. "The CEO wants to speak with you." Ms. Wallace's throat went dry. She lifted the receiver to her ear. "Ms. Bennett." A pause. Then, a voice sharp as a knife. "Ms. Wallace, you and I need to have a conversation." Ms. Wallace swallowed. "Yes, Mom." Evelyn's voice remained controlled, but it was laced with something undeniable, a kind of power that didn't need to be raised to be felt. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Ms. Wallace's pulse hammered. "Ma'am, You made my son feel like he didn't belong, Ms. Wallace." Evelyn's voice dropped. "And I need to know if you understand why that is a problem." Ms. Wallace's hands shook. "Ma'am, I was following standard." "No," Evelyn cut in sharply. "You were following bias. You assumed, without checking, without confirming, that a young black boy in first class was a mistake. But the only mistake made here was yours." Ms. Wallace felt her face burn. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. And then Evelyn spoke again, her voice slow and deliberate. "You will be removed from duty the moment that plane lands." Ms. Wallace's stomach dropped. Evelyn continued. You will undergo mandatory bias training before you are ever allowed to step onto another aircraft." Ms. Wallace gritted her teeth. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to claim it wasn't fair. But deep down, she knew it was. Evelyn's voice hardened. "And you will issue a public apology, one that actually acknowledges what you did." Silence. Then, Ms. Wallace forced the words out. "I understand." Evelyn exhaled sharply. "I hope you do." Then, the line went dead. Ms. Wallace slowly lowered the phone, her hands still trembling. Captain Langston watched her carefully. "Well?" he asked. Ms. Wallace took a deep, shaky breath. "I'm suspended," she whispered. Langston nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." And with that, Ms. Wallace walked out of the cockpit, feeling something she had never felt before. Defeat. Back in first class, Noah looked down at his phone. A new message from his mom. "She won't be bothering you anymore, sweetheart." Noah smirked. Good. Because this was just the beginning. The descent into consequences. The walk of shame. Take 2. Ms. Wallace left the cockpit, her mind spinning. She could still hear Evelyn Bennett's voice in her ears, sharp, unyielding, and full of power. She had never been spoken to like that before. Never been reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. Her steps were slow, her body stiff as she made her way back through the first-class cabin. Passengers watched her as she passed, but no one said a word. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't just a walk down the aisle. It was a public acknowledgement of her failure. She had been the one giving orders, standing with confidence, dictating who belonged and who didn't. And now, she was walking through the plane like a disgraced politician. And at the center of it all, Noah Bennett, sitting comfortably in his oversized seat, his hands resting lightly on his phone, watching her. For the first time in her career, Ms. Wallace felt powerless. And he knew it. A flight crew in chaos. In the galley, the other flight attendants were whispering, exchanging quick, nervous glances. Lisa stood with her arms crossed, watching as Ms. Wallace entered the space. She knew. They all knew. "You got suspended, didn't you?" Lisa asked bluntly. Ms. Wallace didn't answer. She just walked to the counter, gripped the edge with both hands, and inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling with forced composure. "How bad is it?" Another flight attendant, Mark, asked hesitantly. Ms. Wallace's fingers tightened against the counter. "Bias training," she murmured. "Mandatory." Lisa let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, "I hope you take it seriously." Ms. Wallace snapped her head up, eyes blazing. Lisa raised her hands in mock surrender. "Just saying," she continued, "that kind of attitude. It's probably not the first time you've done something like this. Just the first time you got caught." The words hit Ms. Wallace like a punch to the gut. "Lisa, drop it," Mark muttered. Lisa just shrugged and walked off, her tone casual, but her message clear. Everyone knew she had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. The descent into reality. The plane lurched slightly as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our descent into our destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened as we prepare for landing. Thank you for flying with us." Noah gripped his seatbelt, fastening it without looking away from his phone. His heart pounded. Not from nerves. Not from fear. From anticipation. The landing wasn't just about touching the ground. It was about what came next. At the terminal, a scene waiting to unfold. Inside the bustling airport terminal, a team of airline executives, corporate PR officials, and security officers stood waiting at the arrival gate. At the center of them, standing perfectly still, was Evelyn Bennett. Her heels were planted firmly, her expression unreadable, her arms crossed in a way that sent an unmistakable message. Someone was about to answer for what happened today. Lucas stood beside her, his phone in his hand. "They're about to land," he murmured. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. She was already thinking 10 steps ahead. Touchdown. The aftermath begins. When Flight 317 landed, a hushed silence fell over the cabin. Passengers glanced around as if waiting for something to happen. Noah unbuckled his seatbelt and exhaled. This was it. A flight attendant approached him. Not Ms. Wallace. Someone else. "Mr. Bennett, would you like to disembark first?" Noah glanced at her, then at the passengers still seated. Some were watching carefully, others were pretending not to see anything. He shook his head. "No," he said simply. "I'll wait." He didn't need to rush. Because he knew. The moment he stepped off this plane, the real show would begin. Ms. Wallace's final moments on Flight 317. Ms. Wallace stood in the galley, gripping her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She was the last of the crew to exit. She already knew why. Because the moment she stepped off this plane, she wouldn't be coming back. She inhaled sharply, straightening her uniform one last time. Then, as the last few passengers filed out, she stepped into the jet bridge, the artificial lights casting an unforgiving glow over her stiff posture. And there, standing at the gate, waiting just for her, was Evelyn Bennett, face to face with power. The moment Ms. Wallace saw her, she felt it. That quiet authority. The kind of power that didn't need to be announced. It just existed. Evelyn's eyes locked onto hers, sharp, unwavering, calculating. Ms. Wallace opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because really, what could she possibly say? Evelyn took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her voice was soft, but it carried more weight than 1,000 screaming accusations. "You don't belong here anymore." Ms. Wallace swallowed. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "This industry demands accountability, Ms. Wallace." Ms. Wallace stiffened. "I understand." Evelyn nodded once. "Good," she said, "because after today, that's the only thing you have left." With that, Evelyn turned her back on her and walked away, because this conversation was over. And Ms. Wallace, she felt it, the weight of everything she had done, because this wasn't just about one flight, one mistake, one moment. This was a career-ending decision, and she had no one to blame but herself. Noah steps into the spotlight. As Noah walked off the plane, security officers stood nearby, ensuring everything remained under control. His mother was waiting for him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. But the moment their eyes met, her expression softened, and for the first time since this flight began, Noah let out a deep breath, because it was over. Ms. Wallace was done. His mother had handled everything, and yet, Noah knew this story wasn't ending here. Because outside the terminal, reporters were already waiting. Because online, the video of what had happened had already spread. Because people were now asking, how often does this happen? And for the first time in his life, Noah realized something. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a voice. And the world was listening. The ripple effect. When the world starts watching. A storm awakens at the terminal. The doors of the airport terminal slid open, and the sound hit like a wave. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted. Questions were thrown into the air like wildfire. Reporters stood packed in tight clusters, their microphones stretched forward, their expressions hungry for a story. And they had one. A major one. The story of Noah Bennett, the 10-year-old boy who had been humiliated and removed from first class, had exploded online. People weren't just talking about it. They were angry. Social media was already filled with rage-filled posts, hashtags like #JusticeForNoah and #FlyFair trending worldwide. And now the reporters wanted his side of the story. The moment Noah stepped into view, the shouting increased. "Noah, do you think the flight attendant was racist? Ms. Bennett, how is your airline handling this scandal? Was this a tac of disc or I memination? Is the flight attendant going to be fired? Noah froze. He had never experienced anything like this before. He had never been the center of something this big. Evelyn Bennett, standing beside him, did not freeze. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder and leaned in, her voice smooth and powerful. "Keep walking," she whispered. "I'll handle this." And like always, she did. She raised her hand, her posture commanding immediate respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife, "my son is not answering any questions today." A few reporters groaned in frustration, but no one dared push back. Because this was Evelyn Bennett, a woman who had built her airline from the ground up, a woman who had never backed down from a fight. And everyone knew, if she wasn't talking now, she'd be talking soon. With that, she guided Noah through the crowd, ignoring the cameras, the questions, the flashing lights. Because there were bigger battles ahead. The internet takes over. By the time they reached the privacy of the executive lounge, Noah's phone was exploding. Hundreds of notifications, comments, messages, posts. And not just from strangers, from people he knew. Texts from classmates. "Dude, is this you? I saw the video on Twitter." Messages from friends. "Are you okay? I can't believe this happened." Even his teacher had emailed his mother, offering support and saying she wanted to have a discussion about racial bias in class. Noah sat down, his mind racing. This was bigger than he thought. Way bigger. He tapped open one of the trending videos, watching himself get escorted out of his seat, looking confused and small. The comments underneath were brutal. At Flyer Girl 24, "How many times has this happened to someone without a powerful mom to fight for them?" This is the problem with the airline industry. At Truth Seeker 22, "You can't tell me this wasn't discrimination. No way she would have removed a white kid like that without checking." At Businessalite 85, "If a 10-year-old can be treated like this in first class, what's happening in the rest of the plane? What's happening in other industries?" At The Voice of Reason, "Good for the CEO for standing up for her son, but we need systemic change, not just one flight attendant getting fired." Noah scrolled, reading comment after comment, feeling something stir deep inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. He set his phone down, exhaling sharply. His mom had handled it. But maybe it was his turn too. Corporate pressure. A boardroom in crisis. Meanwhile, inside the sleek conference room of Bennett Air's headquarters, the top executives sat in silent tension. The CEO was on her way. And nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Evelyn Bennett had a reputation. She was fair, but she was ruthless when it came to protecting her company. And today, they had all failed her. The door swung open, and she entered without a word. Lucas followed, dropping a thick stack of reports onto the table. "I assume you all know why we're here," Evelyn said, her voice deadly calm. Silence. Then one of the senior VPs, a man named Richard Caldwell, cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, we're aware of the situation, and we err." Evelyn raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't want excuses," she said. "I want solutions." Lucas nodded, flipping open his tablet. "First things first. Public sentiment is against us. The airline is being accused of systemic discrimination." One of the marketing heads shifted uncomfortably. "We don't tolerate discrimination," she said weakly. Evelyn turned cold eyes toward her. "Then why did it happen?" The woman went silent. Lucas continued. "The people don't just want Ms. Wallace held accountable. They want a full-scale review of our training and policies. They want industry-wide change." Evelyn tapped her fingers against the table. Then she made her decision. "We're going to give it to them." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Effective immediately, Bennett Air will be launching a top-down evaluation of bias in the airline industry. We'll be leading the change, not reacting to it. Richard Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. "Ms. Bennett, if we do that, we own the conversation," Evelyn interrupted smoothly. "We control the narrative, and we set the new standard." She glanced around. "Unless any of you have a better idea." No one spoke, because they all knew this wasn't just a PR issue anymore. It was a movement, and Evelyn Bennett was going to make sure they were on the right side of it. Noah's first move. Back in his mother's office, Noah sat across from her, his hands folded. "So," she said, "how are you feeling?" Noah looked up. Then, after a long pause, he said the words that surprised even himself. "I want to do something." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Noah swallowed. "I don't want this to just be about me," he admitted. "I don't want people to only care because of who you are." His mother watched him carefully. He continued, "I've been reading the comments. This happens all the time, just not to people who have someone to fight for them." Evelyn tilted her head, intrigued. "So, what do you want to do?" Noah took a deep breath. "Talk about it." He grabbed his phone. "I want to tell people my story, and I want people to share theirs." Evelyn smiled just slightly. "Then let's make it happen." Noah didn't hesitate. He opened the camera app, hit record, and for the first time, he spoke directly to the world. "Hey, everyone," he said. "My name is Noah Bennett, and this isn't just about me." The legacy of Flight 317. The video that shook the world. Noah stared into his phone's camera, his heart pounding. He had never spoken to this many people before. He had never been the voice of anything. But now, the world was listening. With one deep breath, he pressed record. "Hey, everyone. My name is Noah Bennett, and this isn't just about me." If you've seen the video, you know what happened on Flight 317. But what you don't know is that this happens all the time. People, especially people who look like me, get treated differently every single day. The only reason my story got attention is because my mom owns the airline. But what about the people who don't have someone powerful to fight for them? What about the people who don't have a camera recording when it happens? I want to hear those stories. I want to make sure this doesn't just get talked about for a few days and then forgotten. I want to know, has something like this ever happened to you? If it has, tell me. Share your story. Use hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack or hashtag #FlyFair. Let's talk about this. Because if we don't, nothing will ever change. Noah hit upload before he could second-guess himself. Then he waited, and it didn't take long. Within minutes, the views started rolling in. Then hundreds of comments. Then thousands. And soon, the floodgates had opened. A movement takes off. Noah's video exploded overnight. Celebrities, activists, journalists, athletes, even politicians began reposting it, adding their own thoughts. Everyone was talking. At Ava DuVernay, young King Noah Bennett just did something powerful. This isn't just about one flight. It's about an industry. Time for change. Hashtag #FlyFair. At Barack Obama. Proud of this young man for using his voice. His story is too common, but hopefully his bravery sparks something bigger. Hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack. At LeBron James. Salute to Noah. Speaking up when the world is watching is powerful. Respect, kid. Hashtag justice for Noah. And then, the personal stories started flooding in. At Tasha writes, I remember being told I must be in the wrong section when I upgraded to first class. The flight attendant checked my ticket 3 times. My white seatmate. Not once. Hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack. At Flyer 2020. I've worked in the airline industry for 15 years. Trust me, this is not new. I've seen people get randomly reassigned just for looking out of place. Time for real change. Hashtag #FlyFair. At Momoftu. This happened to my husband last year. The only difference: no cameras, no consequences. This isn't just a mistake. It's a PTTRN. Hashtag systemic bias. It was no longer about no. It was about everyone. And there was no stopping it now. Ms. Wallace faces the fallout. Inside a small, dimly lit apartment, Ms. Wallace sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. Her name was everywhere. Her face was in the headlines. She had received hundreds of messages, some from old colleagues, some from angry strangers, some from people telling her to disappear. And the worst part, she knew she deserved it. The airline had officially suspended her indefinitely. Her career, 20 years of experience, was hanging by a thread. And now the corporate team had sent her one final demand. She had to issue a real apology, publicly. No corporate spin, no watered-down statement, an actual apology. She closed her eyes, her stomach twisting with humiliation and regret. Then she took a deep breath and started typing. The apology that came too late. Hours later, Ms. Wallace's statement was released. I want to start by saying I was wrong. There is no excuse for my actions on Flight 317. I made an assumption, and that assumption was rooted in bias. I saw a young black boy in first class, and without checking the facts, assumed he didn't belong there. That was discrimination, and I take full responsibility for it. I am deeply sorry to Noah Bennett and his family. I am sorry to the passengers who witnessed it, and I am sorry to everyone who has ever experienced something similar and didn't have the privilege of someone powerful stepping in to correct it. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did, but I will do everything in my power to educate myself and make sure this never happens again. I have started anti-bias training. I am speaking with experts about systemic discrimination, and I will be working with organizations that advocate for fair treatment in the airline industry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to be better, and I hope my mistake helps push the industry toward real change. I was part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. The statement spread quickly, but unlike Noah's video, the response was mixed. Some people appreciated it. Some people weren't buying it. And others just thought it was too little too late. But the truth was, Ms. Wallace's future was no longer in her hands. And that was a feeling she had never known before. Bennett Air leads the change. Back in the boardroom at Bennett Air, Evelyn Bennett stood at the head of the table, looking at a team of executives who now knew better than to challenge her. Effective immediately, she said, her voice firm, we are implementing a new set of policies across our airline. A presentation flashed onto the screen behind her. Mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. Secret audits to monitor in-flight treatment. Anonymous reporting channels for discrimination claims. Partnerships with civil rights organizations to improve industry-wide fairness. This isn't about avoiding a scandal, Evelyn continued. This is about setting the standard. She paused, scanning the room. We're going to make sure no other child, no other passenger, and no other person has to go through what my son did. Then she locked eyes with Lucas. Let's make sure the world knows it. Noah's new mission. As Noah sat in his mother's office, scrolling through the thousands of responses to his video, he felt something shift inside him. People weren't just talking. They were demanding change. He wasn't just a kid who got kicked out of first class. He was a part of something bigger now, and he wasn't going to let it stop here. He picked up his phone and started typing. This is just the beginning. We deserve better. And we're not going to stop until we get it. #FlyFair. Then he hit send. And just like that, he stepped into his next fight. Because this wasn't just about one flight. This was about every flight after it. And Noah, he was ready.